It would seem the year is well underway now, and it's time to review all the books, of course, horror and otherwise, that I read in January of 2025. But if you happened to see my last monthly review video, don't freak out. This one will not be quite as long. Well, everything I said at the beginning, before the titles rolled, is true. It is indeed time for my monthly video in which I review all the books I read last month. If you're new here to this channel, welcome. People who've been around for a while already know that because this is a horror channel and I am a horror nerd, we're mostly here for me to review horror books. But because I'm also a nerd generally speaking, not just a horror nerd, a few other different kinds of books also tend to sneak their way into my reading, and this month will be no exception. Before we get to all that, let me just remind you that I always put purchase links down in the What's It, right down there, where you can find all the books that I'll be reviewing. Buying copies, of course, helps to support the authors and your own reading habits, and buying them using my links helps to support my work, so that's all very much appreciated, as of course are all of the YouTube things like sharing, liking, subscribing, and leaving me some comments. I really do read all the comments and I try to respond to as many as I have the time to. Anyway, let's get right to the books. I started off this month, and in fact this year, since we're talking about January, reading two books simultaneously. One of those was a horror novel and the other not a horror novel. It was sort of a timely one, which will make sense when I get to it. But because this is a horror channel, we'll start with the horror novel, because we absolutely must start the year off with a horror novel. And the one I chose was actually one I received as a Christmas gift in this last December, and it's called The Exorcist's House by Nick Roberts. Anyone who knows me knows I'm an absolute nerd for demonic possession stories and exorcism stories. In fact, we'll be getting back to that in a moment with one of these other books. But whether we're talking about fiction, like The Exorcist, even though it was kind of based on a true story, kind of, sort of, a little bit, maybe not really, kind of, or, of course, non-fiction books of exorcists' case files, or theology of exorcism, or all of these kinds of things, I just can't get enough of it. So I was pretty excited to dive into this one, especially after hearing quite a bit of praise for it around the internet book clubs and Facebook groups and comments here on YouTube and on X and all of these kinds of things. People seem to really like this one. The premise here sort of combines two known horror subgenres, the possession or exorcism story, as I mentioned, and the gothic or haunted house story. In this case, we follow a family who've moved into a new farmhouse, only to learn that the previous owner had been a lay exorcist of sorts. Unfortunately, they start to experience a lot of horrifying things, this being a horror novel, of course, as they gradually come to the realization that not only was the previous owner's exorcist work unfinished, but the root of all the evil he had been dealing with seems to be coming from a creepy well in their own new basement. Overall, this is a pretty good book. It's not a perfect one, but there's a lot to like about it. In particular, I'm thrilled by the way it managed to combine and twist those familiar subgenres and all of their associated tropes into something that's actually original. Never while I was reading this did I have that feeling that I've read anything exactly the same before. And of course, in horror, we all know, as much as we love all those tropes, a lot of horror novels or horror movies or horror games can become somewhat formulaic. This one made use of formula and trope when appropriate, and certain elements were recognizable and understandable, and that is sort of the reason for tropes, is so that things are recognizable and the author doesn't need to completely re-explain all of the rules because we already know some things. But this one also never descended into being a really formulaic novel itself. It made use of established ideas and then twisted them into something original. Also, a lot of credit here for an interesting and relatable cast of characters. Though sometimes their dialogue didn't quite ring true to me from a purely mechanical standpoint. I'm talking about the actual grammar and style rather than the thoughts they express or the content of their dialogue. But their struggles and character traits very much did ring true to me. But on that point about the dialogue feeling a little bit awkward at times, I think that's probably the greatest, I don't necessarily want to say flaw, but the greatest flaw or maybe weakness with the book in general is the writing style, which is not bad, it's not unreadable, it's not full of typos or mistakes or anything like that, but it just came across as maybe slightly unpolished, or I'm struggling to put my finger on exactly the right word to describe it. I guess unpolished is probably the closest that I can come to. But not in a horrible way, just maybe in a not quite up to the standards of the plot or characterization, that sort of thing. It did not particularly detract from my enjoyment of the story, but just to give sort of the pluses and minuses, I thought the writing style was maybe the one noticeable weaker point in an otherwise excellent novel. The one other thing that maybe didn't work for me quite 100% was the book's ending. Or I should say, one of the endings. This novel has two things that we can kind of call an ending. It has a climactic scene and then a denouement. Only one of which really worked for me. And I'm reluctant to say too much because I don't want to spoil anything. These are always spoiler-free reviews, unless if I needed to spoil something, I would give you ample warning, but I'm sticking to spoiler-free for today. But while both of the endings, the climax and the denouement, were satisfactory within the world of the novel, and they don't really violate the rules that the story had established, one of them just felt slightly forced when compared to the other one. So we have a strong ending and a weaker ending. And again, I'm not saying either one of them was a bad ending, but just a weaker point in a good novel. Some of those flaws are compensated for not only by a generally good story, but also by one scene in particular, which again, I won't spoil, but which even made this jaded horror fan, I won't say scared, I won't say really grossed out or disturbed or anything, but just a little bit uncomfortable, and I mean that in a good way, because that's the kind of thing that a horror novel ought to be able to do to us. At the end of the day, though, I'm just thrilled to have finally read an exorcism story that wasn't just a blatant ripoff of The Exorcist, so I give it tons of credit for that, and will assuredly be back for more of the author's works in the future. Among them, I believe, is, I think, a prequel to this one. There's at least one other book in this series, and I think it's a prequel. I guess it could be a sequel. I haven't read it yet, but I will certainly be checking that out because this one was quite a good read. The next one isn't a horror novel at all, but rather a slightly outdated yet still somehow timely political book. And that will make sense in just a second because the book is Jimmy Carter's Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. Obviously, the reason I chose to read this one at the beginning of January was in light of President Carter's passing at around that time. It seemed appropriate, since I had a copy lying around here anyway, that I wanted to read his book sort of in his honor. Not saying he was my favorite president or anything, because he certainly wasn't, but it just seemed appropriate to mark the passing of a former president. And in fact, the reason I had a copy of this book lying around in the first place, even though I wasn't particularly interested in reading it until just now, was that I managed to get an autographed copy. right there when President Carter came through town on his book tour back when this book came out, God knows however many years ago. So even though I'm not particularly a fan of Carter's presidency, I consider the book itself as a physical artifact, as a thing, as a piece in my collection to be quite a treasure. Anyway, as to the book itself, I don't want to make this channel into a political argument for or against the argument that President Carter was laying out. So let's just say, in the interest of being a completist and actually reviewing all the books that I've read, we'll leave it that I was not particularly impressed by President Carter's argument. In that way, hopefully we don't all divide ourselves over issues separate from what this channel is really all about, which is, of course, ghost stories and monsters and wonderful things like that. While we're on the topic of some of the non-horror stuff I read this month, let's just go ahead and get a couple more of those out of the way. Fortunately, not political ones in this case, but we'll get those out of the way before we get back to the spooky stuff that we're really all here for. The next of those was another nonfiction book called How to Protect Your Family's Assets from Devastating Nursing Home Costs by K. Gabriel Heiser. Now, speaking as a real nerd for the law, and as the kind of guy who reads dry law books and Supreme Court opinions and these kinds of things for fun, I have to admit, even I was somewhat leery of delving into Medicaid and estate planning law. As one sort of humorous aside in this very book points out, there are probably a lot of bald elder law attorneys out there who've pulled out all their own hair trying to make heads or tails of this ghastly and increasingly convoluted area of the law. But I found myself in the unenviable position of trying to help someone of my acquaintance navigate this estate planning process, and I found this book quite a useful guide. As the book's introduction says, it's not meant to be a substitute for a qualified attorney. You will not understand enough to be able to deal with this body of law after reading a 300 or 400 page, whatever this is, book. However, given the complexity of this body of law, I found it quite helpful in figuring out what kinds of questions to ask of an attorney and to sort of educate myself just enough to be dangerous, but also just enough to take a more active role in the process, rather than just blindly trusting an attorney to figure out the right thing to do. Despite its highly technical subject matter, it's written in an accessible style, and the author made every reasonable attempt to breathe some life into a terribly dry subject, with, I'll say, varying degrees of success. That's not a criticism of the writing style, that's more a criticism of the law, because there's only so many ways you can polish a turd, and estate law is just not all that interesting. But the most important thing is not only that it's written well and accessible, but that it did do a good job of helping me to understand the questions that I should ask and the next steps I should take. Most of the book's chapters won't apply, at least not in their entirety, to most people, but I would recommend a cover-to-cover read, because it's often difficult to know which elements will or won't apply in a particular circumstance, with the possible exception of 2 chapters in this book that are specifically related to veterans' benefits, and the reader automatically knows whether or not veterans' benefits are going to be a relevant part of the conversation or not. So anyway, I don't recommend this for light reading for most people. This is not pleasure reading, but if you find yourself in that position where you need to start thinking about these kinds of things, or someone in your family needs to start thinking about these kinds of things, this would be a pretty good book to get you started. And this is the 18th, I believe. Yeah, 18th edition, was published last year, so it is regularly updated to reflect the constantly shifting and changing field of law. The next one, while also still not a horror novel, was at least more pleasurable reading than elder law, And that was the late great philosopher Roger Scruton's The Soul of the World. This book was published in 2014 and is based on a series of lectures Scruton gave at Cambridge in 2011. Perhaps because of its origin as a series of lectures, or perhaps just because it's a logical arrangement of ideas, the book is divided, of course, into chapters on the subjects of, in order here, God, people, the brain, the first person plural, each other, the earth, music, and finally, returning once again to the idea of God. Those contents, and particularly using conceptions of divinity as bookends for the entire discussion, reveals fundamentally what Scruton is on about here. He's exploring human experience of the sacred from an artistic and philosophical rather than strictly religious perspective. As he puts it in his own words in the introduction, my intention has been to draw on philosophical discussions of mind, art, music, politics, and law in order to define what is at stake in the current disputes over the nature and ground of religious belief. I regard my argument as making room, in some measure, for the religious worldview, while stopping well short of vindicating the doctrine or practice of any particular faith. And that is a much-needed argument indeed, while also forcing myself to stop well short of arguing for or against any particular religious viewpoint or doctrine with which I may agree or disagree. The psychological experience of religion has long been a subject of great interest to me. Scruton's perspective is a little bit different, though. He seems to be connecting the experience of the sacred to something even maybe more abstract or more fundamental than religion itself. He seems to be arguing for a view of the sacred as what I guess we could call an inherent component of the human experience, often but not always connected with religious faith, and which has been too often neglected in contemporary society. It's an unfortunate reality that much of our art, for instance, has gotten ugly and meaningless. Now, don't get me wrong, I enjoy a good piece of mindless schlock just as much as the next guy, so I'm not trying to pick any fights here, particularly on a horror channel where, yes, we have some great stuff, but we've got our share of mindless schlock, and we all tend to like it anyway. But I've noticed a trend of late in which people are drawn more to cheap and easy entertainment instead of anything that dares challenge the intellect. Authors churn out formulaic novels guaranteed to sell just enough copies to pay the rent and then immediately be forgotten. Hollywood, meanwhile, cranks out soulless films that cost an obscene fortune to produce, but leave people feeling like they wasted an hour and a half or 2 hours of their lives, not to mention the cost of admission. And don't even get me started on what's become of our architecture. And it's not just the content of our media that seems to be to blame. Though Scruton never reaches this argument himself, I'm speaking just for myself here, it seems to me that our digital-only world of ebooks and streaming movies and download games that you can't even play off a disc without being able to connect to the internet and all of these kinds of things, this world threatens to devalue our art because of its impermanence and intangibility. Scruton's book, getting back to what we're actually talking about, offers a desperately needed push in the opposite direction. Through discussions ranging from art and music, to philosophy and politics, to science and psychology, he presents a view of a world in which we continue to strive for and experience something sacred, something transcendent, something beyond the mere matter of our own experience. Something, regardless of one's own religious views, we might consider akin to an experience of divinity. And though his book isn't exactly light reading, and occasionally tumbles down an intellectual rabbit hole and drags the reader down the rabbit hole too, it's always ready to pull the reader back with a poetic turn of phrase that sometimes, but maybe not always, expresses a truly original thought, but certainly causes the reader to think about the familiar in a productively novel manner. This is a highly recommended read, and in fact, given the urgency of Scruton's message increasingly these days, I would consider it required reading for anyone with even the slightest hint of intellectual curiosity about the human experience. Returning now, as we must, to thinking about almost everything I read in the context of the horror genre, let's just say that as much as I love, as I said earlier, even the mindless, cheap slasher movies, I do think our favorite genre is ripe for a new renaissance of intellectualism. And I'm not talking about quote-unquote elevated horror in the way the Hollywood hacks talk about it. Horror was already plenty elevated. Dracula, The Exorcist, Hill House. Arguably Dante and Dostoevsky belong to horror, at least much of their work does. Much of Shakespeare belongs to horror. The horror genre doesn't need to be elevated, it already is. We just need to stop de-elevating ourselves and reaching for the lowest common denominator in our horror novels and our horror films. Even when dealing with horrific things, we should strive for the sacred, at least within Scruton's conception thereof. But that, at least in a more fleshed out form, is a different rant for a different day and another video. So stay tuned, because I have a lot to say on the subject. Next up, we're headed back toward the horror genre, albeit still sticking within the realm of nonfiction for just one more book, with A History of Exorcism in Catholic Christianity by Francis Young, part of the Palgrave Historical Studies in Witchcraft and Magic series, which I'm sure isn't the most pleasing of publication placements for Catholic exorcists. They tend not to like things like magic and witchcraft, but that's neither here nor there. And I did promise you earlier in the video I would be getting back to exorcism, and here we are at last. As I sort of alluded to earlier, I've been on a quest of sorts lately to understand exorcism, particularly Catholic exorcism, at as deep a level as I possibly can. But this book fills a void by addressing a subject absent from most of the other books I've read on the topic of exorcism. Typical books on the subject are either skeptical works that seek to debunk demonic possession or the practice of exorcism, or academic works discussing exorcism from a theological perspective, telling us the doctrines of the church, or case studies of particular exorcisms, the ones that have managed to escape the sort of privacy of the ritual and made it to the newspapers or whatever, or memoirs of the exorcists themselves. This is something different. This is the first and so far only book I've read that turns an academic lens on the history of the rite of exorcism without regard to the theology or the reality of it. The closest I've ever come to reading something along these lines in the past were, in fact, the early chapters of Henri Ellenberger's Discovery of the Unconscious, which has nothing to do, through the bulk of its length, with exorcism, but it traced the history of dynamic psychology, in part through its development in parallel with the religious practices, including exorcism, through some of its earlier chapters. But what Francis Young has done here is to trace the development of exorcism itself from early church, or relatively early church history, to the modern era. It should be mentioned right from the start that this book does not set out to endorse nor to debunk the legitimacy of exorcism as a religious or spiritual practice, or indeed as a mental health practice. It does discuss the beliefs and opinions of believers and skeptics alike to the extent that they're necessary to understand how the practice developed over time, but it doesn't take either perspective, treating the subject instead simply as a practice that exists and letting the reader come to his own conclusions about the supernatural claims, or even if one's a skeptic of the supernatural claims, of the legitimacy of exorcism as a practice sort of in a mental health context. Nor is this a complete history of all forms of exorcistic practice. Again, though it alludes to some variants, the book's focus specifically is on the Catholic Church. Now, I suspect many people who search for the word exorcism when shopping for books, be it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or the local bookstore or wherever, they might be disappointed to find that this book absolutely refuses to sensationalize anything. In fact, though it is intended for general audiences and the reader needn't be either a professional historian or, for example, fluent in ecclesial Latin to make sense of it, it is nevertheless written in a formal academic tone and presents such a great density of information that readers looking for something light and casual or creepy and spooky and scary might find it a struggle to get through. But for my money, that's actually the book's advantage, because it means the author gave the subject its intellectual due. The book picks up the narrative in the 4th century and continues through modernity, but with particular emphases on the past rather than the present. Indeed, I found myself wishing a little bit that the book's final chapter, entitled The Return of Exorcism, dealing with developments following the Second Vatican Council, had gone into some greater detail than it did. Though I don't really take issue with anything the author said, for instance, I do agree that much of the popular resurgence of interest in exorcisms began with William Peter Blatty's 1971 novel, The Exorcist, and of course William Friedkin's 1973 film adaptation of the same, and has continued in large part due to sensationalized stories of exorcisms from Hollywood and horror literature. That's all true. The book gets that right. However, while the book does, I think, present a pretty good bird's eye view of the subject, and hits the most important parts of post-Vatican II liturgical reform, I think it misses, to some degree, the impact of things like the internet and social media, as well as some of the nuance in the current debate, even among Catholic clergy, regarding the current state of the rite of exorcism. Similarly, on the other side of things, I found myself wishing the book took up the narrative some centuries earlier than it did. While the 4th century seems like a logical starting place in terms of the Church's beginning to formalize the rite of exorcism, coverage of the practice within the first 300 years of Church history, indeed perhaps drawing connections all the way back to the Scriptures themselves, is somewhat lacking in this history, as is the broader global context of exorcistic rituals in other or pre-Christian religions. Obviously, those are not the focus of this book. This is about Catholic Christianity, so the omission is understandable, but I would argue that an extra chapter, or maybe even half a chapter on the topic, could have helped to situate the book's actual subject in a useful way. But, despite wishing for a bit more on the subject, as I always seem to do whenever I pick up a book on exorcism, I nevertheless highly recommend this one for anyone looking for an academic and historical treatment of a subject that is too often relegated to sensationalistic gossip rags and dime novels, despite a long and rich history that developed in parallel with church history more generally. Now, obviously, we simply must end the month by returning to our favorite genre and close out my January reading with a horror novel. And indeed, I've got just what the doctor ordered, and it's this book by Joe Netter called Zombie Bukkake, of all things. It's really hard to know what to say about a book like this. It's useful, often when reviewing a book, to talk a bit about what happens in the story, but in addition to having some concerns about spoilers, which I am trying to avoid, there's also the matter that if I said almost any of the things that happen in this book, I could very easily get kicked off of YouTube for talking about some of this stuff. So let's just say that the story is exactly what you'd expect from a book with this title, and it's every bit as filthy and gore-soaked as I'd hoped from such a novel. But at the same time, going back to what I was mentioning earlier about not being just schlock but trying to have some emotionality in our horror, there's actually a lot more than I expected to this as well. That doesn't mean it's not exactly what it sounds like, because it is, but despite sounding like the Dirty Dime novel, which it has all those elements, there's actually some genuine character development and some real heart here as well. So it sort of surprised me. I knew it was going to be good. I knew it was going to be fun, and I was expecting just fun, but there's more depth to it than one would expect. So it hit sort of on multiple levels. Unfortunately, as far as I know, this book is out of print, so I'm not sure how hard it's going to be to find. As I do with all the other books, I will do my best to put purchase links for you down in the What's It. Reminder. But I'm just not sure whether or not this is going to be an easy one to find, so we'll do what we can. Be that as it may, if you can find a copy, I'd recommend grabbing one, both because apparently it's getting harder to find, and because if the title sounds like the sort of thing that you would find amusing to read, and you're watching this channel, so I assume you're as sick and twisted as I am, there's actually a lot more to the book than even I expected, so it really is actually a good one. And when you do buy a copy, be sure to bring it with you and read it in public, because I can vouch for just how funny the expressions you'll see on people's faces will be. Anyway, that does it for this month's reading, or should I say last month, since I'm always talking about the previous month when I do these things. Anyway, you get the point. We're talking about January, the end of January's reading. So hopefully this has turned you on to some good stuff that you might not otherwise have read. Do be sure to subscribe and all that kind of stuff. And most importantly of all, as always, take care and stay scared.